The sky over the small town of Whispering Pines, Georgia, was so clear that morning that it felt like an intentionally painted canvas. The crisp air carried a faint scent of damp earth and blooming pine needles, a remnant of a silent dawn that lingered long after the sun rose. Neighbors opened their wooden shutters, greeting each other with soft nods, feeling a subtle excitement they could not quite define. Yet, deep down, everyone knew the reason for this collective joy. Today was the wedding day. The marriage of Jason Montgomery to Chloe Sanders had been the sole topic of conversation in the county for over 6 months, a union that seemed to defy the unwritten social laws of the Deep South. Jason was the sole heir to a massive real estate and agricultural empire, bearing a surname that commanded immediate respect in any boardroom across the state. Chloe, conversely, was the daughter of a humble peanut farmer, a young woman who spent her afternoons preparing homemade Southern lunchboxes for truck drivers at a small roadside pavilion. The townsfolk whispered about the match, unable to comprehend how a man of his stature could choose a girl from the red clay fields. Jason had always laughed off their concerns, convincing everyone, including himself, that his affection was entirely immune to the opinions of high society. At the Sanders homestead, located at the end of a long gravel road lined with ancient oak trees, the day began well before the first light of dawn. Arthur Sanders, a man whose hands were permanently calloused from decades of labor, put the old iron kettle on the stove and stepped out onto the porch. He sat heavily in his favorite wooden rocking chair, staring blankly at a small patch of wild white roses his late wife had planted 20 years ago. The bush was in full bloom, its delicate petals holding drops of dew that caught the morning light like tiny diamonds. Arthur took a deep, shaky breath. He was not a man of many words, but his chest felt remarkably heavy with an emotion he could not name. When Chloe stepped through the screen door into the kitchen, her hair still loose and her face washed clean, Arthur turned his gaze toward her and felt an immediate tightening in his throat. She was smiling, that quiet, unbothered smile that always made the room feel warmer. She wished him a good morning, but Arthur could only manage a slow nod, unable to force any words past the lump in his throat. He drank his black coffee in absolute silence while she went into her bedroom to prepare. When she finally emerged, wearing a simple white cotton dress and holding a bouquet she had gathered from the backyard, Arthur quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his rough hand before she could notice. Chloe noticed, of course, but she pretended not to see her father's rare display of vulnerability. She stepped closer, leaning down to press a soft kiss against his forehead, and whispered that he mustn't cry, or she would start crying too and ruin her makeup. The old man let out a short, wet laugh, and for a long moment, father and daughter stood together in that small kitchen smelling of old wood and fresh chicory coffee. Across town, in a grand brick estate surrounded by manicured lawns, Jason Montgomery was adjusting his silk tie in front of a gilded mirror, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely manage the knot. He wore a tailored dark suit, his leather shoes polished to a high shine, but his anxious eyes betrayed a deep, suffocating restlessness that had haunted him for days. Lucille Montgomery entered her son's dressing room without the courtesy of a knock, stepping into the space with the absolute authority someone who believed she owned the entire world. She scrutinized Jason from head to toe, gave a stiff nod of approval, and coldly informed him that the vintage car was waiting at the front gates. Jason nodded silently, grabbed his jacket, and followed her out into the humid morning air. The historic Presbyterian church in the heart of town had been transformed with white lilies and elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than an average local family earned in a full year. The wooden pews were packed to capacity, with people standing in the aisles and peering through the stained glass windows from the courtyard outside. The elderly pastor stood at the altar, holding a well-worn Bible, his seasoned smile suggesting he had witnessed enough weddings to remain detached from the spectacle. Jason stood beside him, his eyes glued to the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the sanctuary, anxiously awaiting Chloe's arrival. For a few brief minutes, everything progressed exactly as tradition dictated. The organist played softly, and the air was thick with the rich scent of perfume and expensive wax. Then, Jason felt the sharp vibration of his cellular phone inside his breast pocket, a distraction he initially chose to ignore until it buzzed repeatedly. He discreetly withdrew the device and stared at the screen to find a message from his mother, who was seated in the front pew less than 30 feet away. Jason looked up and met Lucille's piercing gaze. She gave a sharp, unmistakable tilt of her head that he had understood since his early childhood, a gesture that commanded his immediate presence. He whispered a brief apology to the startled pastor, stepped down from the elevated altar, and walked into a small, secluded vestry near the side entrance where his mother was already waiting. Lucille did not waste a single second. She closed the heavy door firmly, took a shallow breath, and spoke in a harsh, disciplined whisper. She claimed she needed to share a vital truth about the girl, something she had uncovered the previous evening that Jason had to hear before destroying his family's legacy. Jason stared at her, pleading that this was not the proper time. But Lucille insisted it was the only time that mattered. She proceeded to plant a meticulously crafted narrative in her son's mind, filled with specific, manufactured details that sounded far too plausible to be questioned in a moment of extreme panic. She claimed Chloe had lied about her identity, her intentions, and the true reason she had agreed to wear his ring. Lucille asserted she possessed undeniable proof of the girl's deception, arguing that no self-respecting Montgomery could possibly look at such a woman without shame. Jason listened as his heart battered against his ribs, his mind desperately trying to recall every tender moment he had shared with Chloe, but the lie was sophisticated, precise, and engineered to exploit his deepest insecurities. Outside the small vestry, a collective murmur began to ripple through the crowded church as the pastor glanced anxiously at his pocket watch and guests exchanged confused looks. The organist continued to play the same melody on a loop, but the atmosphere had shifted into a heavy, palpable tension that everyone felt, but no one dared to voice aloud. Then the heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary finally swung open, and Chloe entered the church, her arm resting gently on the steady forearm of her father. The simple white dress she had chosen against the advice of high society boutiques looked absolutely flawless on her, devoid of unnecessary lace or ostentatious jewels. She held her humble backyard bouquet with an air of quiet dignity, her face radiant with the unshielded joy of a woman who was not afraid to love completely. The entire congregation turned their heads toward her, some smiling with genuine warmth while others stared with open mouths. Chloe walked down the long carpeted aisle with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes scanning the elevated altar for Jason. But the space where the groom should have stood was completely empty. Her feet came to a sudden halt in the middle of the aisle, her body seemingly understanding the tragedy before her mind could fully process it. The pastor remained there, the lilies were there, the music continued to play, but Jason was nowhere to be found. The absolute silence that enveloped the sanctuary in that precise moment was a physical weight, a suffocating quiet that pressed heavily on the shoulders of everyone present. Chloe did not collapse into tears. She did not scream, and she did not run from the building. She simply stood frozen in the center of the aisle, her knuckles white around the stems of her flowers. Arthur felt his daughter's arm turn rigid beneath his touch, and he tightened his grip, offering the only silent support he could muster. One of the bridesmaids was the first to break the spell, stepping forward with a gasping breath before the murmurs exploded into a chaotic din of questions and frantic movement. Someone rushed outside to check the gravel parking lot, while another guest tried desperately to dial Jason's number, only to find the line completely dead. The pastor closed his heavy Bible with a slow, solemn motion, recognizing that his services would no longer be required on this day. Chloe took one deep, ragged breath and turned her head to look at her father, who was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, nor was it simple pity. It was the ancient, helpless sorrow of a father who realized he had failed to shield his child from the cruelty of the world. She placed her small hand over his trembling fingers and whispered softly, asking him to take her away from this place, and Arthur immediately turned her around. They walked back down the long aisle with their heads held high, refusing to run or look at the 200 pairs of eyes that burned into their backs like heavy stones. Chloe did not shed a single tear in front of the crowd, maintaining an iron resolve until they reached the safety of her father's old pickup truck. Across the state line, a Polaroid sedan was traveling down the main highway at a high, unbroken speed, moving further away from the small town with every passing minute. Lucille sat in the front passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery with a cold, triumphant expression that brooked no argument. Jason sat in the driver's seat, his hands frozen on the leather steering wheel, staring blankly at the asphalt ahead without uttering a single word. He refused to look in his rearview mirror, entirely unaware that by choosing to drive away, he had left behind something far more valuable than his family's pride. Whispering Pines was a very small town, and small towns have an absolute inability to guard secrets for more than a few hours. In the painful days that followed the wedding that never happened, Chloe Sanders' name was spoken at every street corner, every grocery store counter, and every front porch gathering. The townsfolk spoke with a volatile mixture of superficial pity and intense curiosity, a form of social judgment disguised as neighborly concern. They whispered that the poor girl should have known better than to believe a wealthy heir could truly love someone from the red clay fields. They argued that the world possessed a strict, unyielding order, and anyone who attempted to climb beyond their designated station would inevitably pay a terrible price. Chloe heard none of these cruel conversations because she had completely vanished from the public eye, retreating into the deep isolation of her father's farm. On the morning that should have been the first day of her new life, she woke up in her childhood bed, staring at the white dress folded neatly over a wooden chair. The backyard flowers were already beginning to wither on her dresser, their petals curling and losing their vibrant color in the morning heat. She stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling an immense hollow vacuum inside her chest that was far worse than anger or sorrow. Arthur knocked softly on her door and entered the room holding a single porcelain mug of hot chicory coffee, placing it on the nightstand without saying a word. He stood beside her bed for a long moment, looking down at his only daughter, and though neither of them spoke, it was the longest conversation they had ever shared. 3 days after the disaster, Chloe packed a small leather suitcase, took her meager savings from an envelope in her dresser, and asked her father not to question where she was going. Arthur did not ask. He simply walked her to the front door, holding the heavy bag while she tied the laces of her worn canvas shoes. When she reached out to take the suitcase from his hand, the old man did not let go immediately, waiting until she looked up to meet his eyes. He told her she could come back whenever she wanted, reminding her that the old farmhouse would always belong to her, and Chloe nodded before stepping out into the heat. She spent the next several weeks in a neighboring town, renting a cramped, damp room in a boarding house that smelled constantly of old soap and river moisture. She found temporary work washing greasy dishes in the back of a local diner, but she left after the owner became uncomfortable with the way she watched the kitchen line. She didn't look with envy, but with a sharp, disciplined focus that he could not comprehend. She spent her free days walking aimlessly along unfamiliar streets, sitting on chipped park benches, and observing the ordinary lives of strangers passing by. She was desperately trying to figure out what to do with the vast, empty space that Jason's sudden departure had left inside her soul. It was during this period of deep isolation, inside the small, stained bathroom of the boarding house, that Chloe stared at a small plastic indicator for what felt like an eternity. Her trembling hand moved to her face, and she sat down on the cold linoleum floor, breathing slowly as she realized that this tiny object changed absolutely everything. She did not reach for the telephone. She did not call Jason, and she did not approach the wealthy Montgomery family to demand financial compensation or an explanation. She sat on the edge of her sagging mattress with the positive test in her hands and made a definitive choice entirely on her own terms. She would face this upcoming reality with whatever strength she possessed, refusing to rely on a man who had abandoned her when the world became difficult. She returned to her father's peanut farm a few weeks later without sending any prior notice, arriving late in the afternoon with her small suitcase. Arthur was sitting on the front porch when she walked through the wooden gate, his tired eyes watching her approach along the dusty gravel path. He did not ask for explanations. He simply opened his long arms, and Chloe buried her face in his flannel shirt, finally letting go of the heavy burden she had carried alone. In the months that followed, Chloe did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy around the farm, helping her father tend to the crops, feeding the chickens, and sweeping the wooden porch. Yet Arthur noticed a subtle change in his daughter's movements, a new, deliberate caution, a protective way she carried herself that had never been there before. The day he discovered her secret was entirely devoid of theatrical drama or tearful confrontations. Arthur had walked into the kitchen to fetch a glass of water on a Tuesday afternoon and found a folded piece of paper from a prenatal clinic sitting on the wooden table. He didn't need to open the document to understand what it meant. He simply stared at the clinic's letterhead for a long moment before placing it back exactly where he found it. That evening, when Chloe joined him on the porch after supper, they sat in their respective chairs beneath a sky thick with southern stars. Without saying a word, Arthur extended his right arm, and Chloe moved her chair closer, resting her head against her father's sturdy shoulder. He asked no questions, and she offered no confessions. The silent embrace communicated everything their pride had kept hidden. A few weeks later, in the dark hours before dawn, Chloe woke up with a sharp, terrifying pain that she would never find the words to describe to another living soul. She called out for her father in a weak, breathless voice, and Arthur rushed into her room, immediately recognizing the severity of the emergency. He carried her out to his old truck, driving down the dark county roads with a desperate urgency that he carefully hid from his face to keep her from panicking. They reached the small community hospital in the next county, but the rural facility lacked the specialized equipment needed for such a complicated premature crisis. The young doctor on duty did everything humanly possible with the limited resources at his disposal, but his efforts were not enough to save the fragile life within her. The next afternoon, Chloe returned to the farmhouse empty-handed, walking straight into her bedroom and closing the door until the sun began to sink below the tree line. Arthur sat on the floor outside her door. For hours, his back pressed against the wood, simply ensuring she knew he was there. When she finally emerged, her eyes were entirely dry, and her face was cast in a terrifyingly calm expression that was far more painful to witness than tears. She walked into the kitchen, lit the gas stove, and began preparing a large meal with an absolute, unbroken concentration. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching her chop vegetables with a fierce rhythm, as if the physical act of cooking was the only thread keeping her anchored to the earth. Neither of them ever spoke about that terrible night at the hospital, but Arthur began waking up before the sun every single morning just to make sure the kitchen light was already on. Across the state line, Jason Montgomery was signing his name on a marriage certificate in a small, sterile courthouse ceremony, standing beside a wealthy debutante named Florence Vance. Lucille sat in the front row with a disciplined, satisfied smile, convinced she had successfully protected her son's future from ruin. Jason signed the documents without looking at his new bride, slipping the platinum band onto his finger with a profound sense of detachment. None of this news ever reached the Sanders farm because Chloe had made a conscious decision to banish Jason's memory from her daily life. She had a life that required her complete attention, a future that needed to be constructed from scratch, with her own two hands on the soil that had always kept her safe. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, while reorganizing an old storage trunk in her late mother's room, that Chloe discovered a weathered, leather-bound notebook. The pages were covered in her grandmother's elegant, slanted handwriting, containing not just culinary instructions, but wisdom on how to survive the winters of the soul. The old pages advised to wait until the butter sings in the iron skillet before adding the onions, and reminded her that true love leaves a permanent warmth in the belly long after the meal is finished. Chloe read every single page before walking into the kitchen to prepare her grandmother's traditional beef stew that very evening. Arthur tasted the first spoonful, held the wooden utensil in the air for a long moment, and remarked that it tasted exactly like the meals from his youth. Something ignited within Chloe that night, a spark of purpose that had been missing since the day she was left at the altar. The following week, she prepared 10 homemade lunchboxes and sold them to local utility workers and truck drivers at the roadside pavilion. Within a month, the order grew to 30 boxes a day, and a line of vehicles began forming along the gravel road each afternoon. Truck drivers passing through the county began making specific detours just to purchase a hot meal from the quiet young woman at the Sanders farm. Arthur watched the growing crowd from his rocking chair, occasionally stepping into the kitchen to offer his quiet, invaluable praise. With the money earned from her lunchboxes, saved dollar by dollar in an old tin can, Chloe enrolled in a professional culinary program at a technical college an hour away. She woke up at 4 o'clock every morning to catch the first regional bus, carrying a heavy insulated bag of warm meals to sell to commuters along the way to pay for her fare. The instructors at the academy noticed her immediately. She possessed a rare, visceral relationship with food that could never be taught in a modern classroom. Her skill did not come from textbook study, but from a deep well of survival, a need to create beauty when everything else had fallen apart. During that same autumn, while Arthur was collecting the mail at the local post office, the clerk handed him a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing an out-of-state postmark. The recipient's name written across the front was Chloe Sanders, but the return address belonged to a law firm representing Jason Montgomery. Arthur stared at the envelope for a long time at the wooden counter, then folded it carefully and slid it into his flannel shirt pocket before driving home. That night, while Chloe was asleep, he opened an old cedar drawer in the hallway, hid the letter beneath his late wife's lace veil, and closed the drawer silently. He had no idea what words were written inside that expensive paper, but he knew exactly who it came from, and he believed his daughter required more time before facing that ghost. Chloe remained entirely unaware of the hidden letter, focusing all her energy on her studies, her business, and her father's health. She continued to build a life that no one in high society had planned for her, a life that was becoming entirely, beautifully her own. The time passed in that quiet, unbothered way it does when a person refuses to surrender to their circumstances, slowly stacking the months until the past began to lose its sharpest edges. The Sanders farm slowly transformed into the Roots Homestead Bed and Breakfast, a project that began without a formal sign or a grand marketing strategy. It started when a couple of traveling journalists stopped at the farm, drawn by the incredible aroma of fresh biscuits and roasted pecans wafting from the kitchen. They didn't want a simple lunchbox. They asked if they could pay to sit on the porch and enjoy a full country breakfast in the shade of the oaks. Chloe charged them a fair price, and as they were leaving, the woman remarked that if there were a room available, they would gladly spend the entire weekend on the property. Within 2 months, with the physical help of Arthur and 2 neighbors who volunteered their labor in exchange for daily meals, Chloe renovated the old guest rooms at the back of the house. The walls were painted a clean white. The pine floors were scrubbed until they shone, and the windows offered an unbroken view of the wild white rose bushes. She painted a small wooden sign by hand and hung it at the entrance of the driveway, Roots Homestead, Lodging and Southern Kitchen. The first official guest arrived on a warm Friday evening, and by the following spring, the rooms were booked solid for 3 months in advance. Chloe was exhausted from the endless physical labor, but it was a vibrant, fulfilling exhaustion that belonged to a creator rather than a victim. Arthur began waking up even earlier, sweeping the gravel paths, repairing the porch swings, and ensuring the plumbing was immaculate before the guests opened their eyes. One morning, Chloe found him planting fresh rows of blue hydrangeas along the walkway leading to the guest entrance. She paused on the porch and asked when he had decided to become a gardener, and the old man simply shrugged, stating that folks appreciate a touch of color when they first arrive. The business expanded through word-of-mouth recommendations, its reputation for unmatched hospitality traveling far beyond the borders of the county. It was during this prosperous season that a woman named Marilyn, a senior editor for a national travel magazine, arrived without a reservation. She stayed for 4 days, eating every meal at the communal porch table, talking with Arthur about the history of the land, and watching Chloe work in the kitchen with a quiet intensity. The subsequent article Marilyn published was not a simple review. It was a beautifully written narrative about a woman who had transformed grief into nourishment. The piece featured stunning photographs of the oak trees, the morning light hitting the iron skillets, and a candid shot of Chloe looking out the kitchen window. The article went viral online, shared by thousands of travelers who felt a sudden, deep yearning for the authenticity the Sanders farm offered. The telephone at the homestead began ringing continuously, and the waiting list for a weekend reservation stretched to half a year. A regional newspaper published a short profile on the business in their financial section, a small feature that found its way onto a mahogany desk in an executive high-rise 300 miles away. Jason Montgomery was enduring a tedious corporate meeting when his business partner slid a tablet across the conference table, pointing at the feature article. Jason looked at the screen, read the name of the establishment, and felt his breath catch in his throat as the red clay fields of his youth rushed back into his mind. Chloe's memory had never truly left him. She was a permanent shadow in his thoughts, a presence he had tried to bury beneath long work hours and an unhappy, short-lived marriage that had ended in divorce a year prior. Seeing her name in a business publication, associated with something grand she had built entirely on her own, sparked a profound ache deep within his chest. He returned the tablet to his partner, claiming he had never heard of the place. But that night alone in his empty apartment, he read Marilyn's article repeatedly. He stared at the photograph of Chloe's back as she looked out her kitchen window, unable to sleep as the reality of his past cowardice began to crush him. A few weeks later, a midnight phone call from a hospital administrator forced him to confront the final, terrible truth of his family's history. Lucille Montgomery had suffered a severe stroke, and as Jason sat by her bedside in the sterile room, he looked at a woman who seemed entirely stripped of her former grandeur. In a weak, trembling voice, stripped of the arrogance that had defined her existence, Lucille confessed the absolute truth about the day of the wedding. She admitted there had never been any proof, that she had manufactured every single accusation out of a desperate, selfish need to maintain control over his life. Then, she delivered the final blow. She revealed that she had intercepted a medical notice indicating Chloe was expecting a child before the wedding. Jason left the hospital room in absolute silence, stepping out into the cool night air as his world fractured into 1,000 unfixable pieces. He got into his car, began driving toward Whispering Pines, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the words 6 kilometers flashed on his navigation screen from the highway exit. The gravel road felt rougher than he remembered, the tires kicking up clouds of red dust as the ancient oak trees began to close in around him. He parked his polished vehicle on the grass shoulder outside the wooden gate, his heart hammering against his ribs as he caught sight of the hand-painted sign. Through the open kitchen window, Jason could see Chloe standing in front of the commercial stove, her hair tied back as she stirred a large pot of simmering preserves. He stood by the wooden fence for a long time, paralyzed by the sheer weight of his regret, all his carefully rehearsed apologies evaporating into the humid afternoon air. Arthur was the first to notice his presence, stepping out from the tool shed with an iron wrench in his calloused hand, his eyes locking onto the wealthy intruder. There was no explosive violence in the old farmer's face. Instead, his eyes held a deep, unyielding disappointment that was far more painful for Jason to endure than anger. Arthur turned without speaking and entered the house, and a moment later, the front door opened again, and Chloe stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple canvas apron, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, with a small trace of flour dusting her forearm. They stared at each other across the small distance for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them heavy with the unsaid traumas of the last 6 years. Chloe walked down the porch steps, her boots clicking against the gravel until she stood on the opposite side of the low wooden fence. She looked into Jason's eyes and asked him, with a voice that was terrifyingly steady, why he had never returned to find her after the dust had settled. She clarified that she wasn't asking about the day he left her at the altar, but about the long years that followed, demanding to know if he had ever truly cared enough to seek the truth. Then she asked the question that broke his remaining resolve. She asked if he had known about the baby she had carried and lost in the dark. Jason looked at her, his voice breaking as he swore on his life that he had been completely blind to her pregnancy until his mother's deathbed confession. The raw, unfactured agony in his voice caused a brief, subtle crack in Chloe's stone-cold expression, a momentary glimpse of the girl he had abandoned. She turned around without saying another word and walked back into the house, leaving the front door resting wide open behind her. Jason opened the wooden gate with slow, hesitant fingers, stepping onto the porch and entering the warm, fragrant sanctuary of her kitchen. The kitchen of Ruth's homestead possessed an immediate, involuntary comfort that no high-end interior designer could ever replicate, smelling of fresh yeast, roasted pecans, and old cedar wood. Jason stood near the screen door, watching Chloe as she continued her work at the stove, her movements fluid and precise, despite the emotional storm in the room. She gestured toward a sturdy oak chair without turning her head, and Jason sat down at the weathered table, his eyes tracing the deep lines in the old wood. Chloe turned off the burners, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat directly across from him, her tired eyes holding a lifetime of survival. Jason spoke for an hour, detailing the lies his mother had spun in that church vestry, admitting his own unforgivable weakness in choosing to believe a convenient falsehood over the woman he loved. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He simply laid out the bare, ugly truth of his cowardice, refusing to offer any excuses for the damage he had caused. Chloe listened to his confession without a single interruption, then calmly narrated her own history. The lonely nights in the boarding house, the terrifying midnight drive to the rural hospital, and the agonizing silence of a nursery that never came to be. Jason wept silently, his face buried in his hands as the true cost of his departure was laid bare on the kitchen table. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a faded, water-stained envelope on the wood between them. A letter he had mailed to her weeks after the wedding, filled with pleas for communication. Arthur stepped into the kitchen at that moment, his deep voice breaking the silence as he confessed that he had intercepted that specific letter from the post office years ago, hiding it away to protect his daughter from further torment. Chloe looked at her father, then at Jason, realizing with a heavy heart that everyone in her life had made choices designed to shield her, yet those very protections had left her utterly isolated in her grief. She told Jason she had eventually found and read that letter years later, but without his physical presence, she had written it off as a final, cruel farewell. Chloe rose from the table, took 3 ceramic bowls from the cupboard, and served the hot stew she had prepared, placing a portion in front of Jason with a simple command to eat before it grew cold. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but a profound display of her humanity. A statement that life must continue to be nourished even in the presence of old ghosts. Jason stayed at the homestead that night, renting a guest room at the standard commercial rate, and the following morning, he traded his expensive suit for a plain denim shirt. He approached Arthur on the porch, asking for a pair of work gloves, and spent the next week repairing a collapsed fence line at the edge of the property under the old man's silent supervision. The weeks dissolved into a quiet, disciplined routine. Jason performed the heaviest labor around the farm without complaint, slowly earning a fragile truce with Arthur over shared buckets of well water. There remained a careful, deliberate distance between Chloe and Jason, an unspoken agreement that their shared past was far too fragile to be rushed into a conventional romance. One evening, Chloe confronted him on the porch regarding a substantial financial transfer that had been made to the bed and breakfast bank account from an anonymous corporate entity. Jason admitted he had uncovered the exact medical debts she had incurred during her hospital stay and had quietly paid them off before ever gathering the courage to show his face at the farm. He emphasized that the money was not an attempt to buy her forgiveness, but a necessary act of responsibility to clear a debt that should have been his to carry from the very beginning. Chloe looked out at the blue hydrangeas her father had planted, telling Jason that she had not broken under the weight of his abandonment, and that the grand business before them was proof of her independent strength. Jason agreed completely, stating he had returned to the farm not because she needed him, but because he needed to look into her eyes and acknowledge the full depth of his mistake. Arthur joined them on the porch, offering a rare piece of wisdom, stating that while he would never forget the pain Jason caused, a man's character is ultimately defined by what he chooses to build with the pieces of his remaining days. The path toward healing is never a straight line. It is a slow, often painful restructuring of the inner architecture of the human heart, requiring an immense amount of patience and a willingness to sit with old wounds without demand. True maturity does not look for quick fixes or grand gestures of dramatic forgiveness. It understands that the deep trust broken over a matter of hours can take a lifetime of consistent, quiet actions to restore. As the seasons began to shift across the Georgia countryside, the red clay fields absorbing the cool rains of late autumn, the atmosphere around the Roots homestead grew lighter. Chloe and Jason learned to exist within the same space without the constant necessity of defending their old positions, allowing their daily actions to speak louder than any rehearsed apology ever could. Life, in its infinite complexity, rarely offers us the chance to undo the specific tragedies of our youth, but it offers something far more valuable: the opportunity to grow wide enough to encompass our grief and turn it into a source of deep, resonant strength. The true measure of a human being is not found in their moments of absolute purity, but in their capacity to face the ugly truths of their own past and begin the long, unglamorous work of reconstruction. For the older generation who have watched the decades pass like water over stone, there is a profound understanding that resentment is a poison we drink ourselves while hoping our enemies will suffer. True freedom is found when we finally lay down the heavy burden of what might have been and open our hands to the imperfect beauty of what actually exists before us. Chloe had built an empire of hospitality out of the ruins of her broken heart, and Jason had finally stripped away the armor of his wealth to stand as an honest man in the dirt. One afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the branches of the ancient oaks, Chloe stepped down into the garden holding a small sapling of a white dogwood tree. Jason joined her without being asked, taking the heavy iron spade from her hands to dig the deep, fertile earth near her grandmother's old rose bushes. They placed the fragile roots into the ground together, their hands brushing against the cool red clay, and as they poured the water over the fresh soil, Arthur watched them from his wooden rocking chair with a peaceful smile. The future remained entirely unwritten, devoid of guarantees or superficial promises. But the roots were finally in the ground, and in the quiet wisdom of a long life, that was more than enough to begin again.